and today we're delving into a case that shook Wales and the UK to its core, a story that brings to light the darkest corners of human nature and the strength of small communities. This is the story of April Jones. This episode contains sensitive content that some listeners may find upsetting. Listener discretion is advised. On the evening of October 1st, 2012, the small, tight-knit town of Machynlleth in Wales was thrust into a nightmare that would leave scars for years to come. 5-year-old April Jones had been playing outside with her friends, a regular, carefree activity that had never raised concerns. But that evening, something went terribly wrong. April disappeared, and the peaceful town of Machynlleth was plunged into chaos. In today's episode, we'll explore who April Jones was, a bright, happy child loved by everyone who knew her. We'll talk about the events leading up to that fateful evening, the frantic search that followed, the investigation that eventually led to a chilling discovery. We'll also delve into the trial, the community response, and the legacy that April has left behind. On April 4th, 2007, April Sue Lynn Jones was born to Mum Coral and Dad Paul in the charming town of Machynlleth in North Wales. April had an older sister, Jasmine, who was 12 years April's senior, and an older brother, Harley. Jasmine actually named April after the month she was born in. April needed some extra care due to the fact that she was born with cerebral palsy, and her family really rallied around to provide that care for her. It seems that from an interview Jasmine did a few years ago with the Daily Mail, the two sisters had a really close relationship, so much so that Ja was actually April's first word. As April grew up, she began to develop into a sweet and loving little girl who loved spending time with her friends and was also involved in swimming lessons. On October 1st, 2012, not long after returning from these swimming lessons, April had a friend she knew from school over to watch Tangled. However, I'm sure we can all relate, the friends just didn't want their time playing together to end, so April pleaded with her parents to let them play outside for a bit, and they eventually gave in after a lot of convincing on April's behalf. However, Coral caveated this by saying to not go too far away and to be back in at a reasonable time as it was already getting quite dark. And that was the last time her parents would see April, pedalling away on a small pink bike at around 7 p.m. We know April was still playing with her friends on the Brynagog housing estate in Machynlleth at 7:15 p.m. However, Coral went to find her at approximately 7:20 that evening and unfortunately couldn't find her anywhere. So Coral dialed 999 at 7:30 to report April as missing to Dyfed-Powys Police, which is the regional police force for that area. When an officer arrived at the scene, panic really began to set in when speaking with a child witness who reported seeing April getting into a vehicle willingly, a grey Land Rover driven by a man she appeared to know. So much so, Dyfed-Powys wasted no time in upgrading the investigation to critical incident status. The College of Policing defines a critical incident as, quote, any incident where the effectiveness of the police response is likely to have a significant impact on the confidence of the victim, their family, and or the community. And sadly, April's disappearance would leave nothing short of a significant impact on her family and the wider community. Her sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through the community, which is fairly small in size, Machynlleth having a population size of about 2,000. Due to the tightly knit nature of the town, it's no surprise that panic ensued quite quickly, with social networks being integral in some ways to spreading the message of April's disappearance and coordinating search efforts in the area. Within hours, the entire town had mobilised, with volunteers joining the search alongside police and emergency services, and many searching well into the early morning hours of October 2nd. But as the hours turned into days, the hope of finding April alive and well began to fade. Less than 24 hours after April went missing, Dyfed-Powys police arrested a 46-year-old man matching the description of the man driving the vehicle April got into, with the vehicle also matching that description, being a grey Land Rover Discovery. This man was Mark Bridger. Mark Bridger, born Mark Leonard Bridger, was originally born in London in 1965 to mother Pamela and father Graham, the latter of which, interestingly, was a police officer himself. I couldn't find anything particularly alarming from his early childhood. He grew up in a semi-detached home in a family-friendly area of London. He achieved decent grades at school, but would never really specialise in a career. In fact, Mark's work history is incredibly varied, working jobs such as an abattoir worker, hotel porter, fireman, lifeguard and welder. At the age of 19, Mark was convicted of firearms offences and theft, before moving to Wales, where he was later convicted of criminal damage, driving without insurance, and affray, which is basically the use or the threat of the use of violence, causing the victim to feel a sense of real threat over their own safety. He did get married some years after moving to Wales, where he had 2 children, but he also had another 4 children by 3 additional women. Mark Bridger was an acquaintance of Coral and Paul Jones, which makes it so much worse, but then again, it is important to remember that most perpetrators of child abuse do tend to be someone known to the victim or their family. On top of this, his entanglement with the law would not stop at the prior mentioned offences. He was also convicted of driving whilst disqualified and without insurance, and at another point for battery, threatening behaviour and assault. So with over 10 convictions under his belt, Mark Bridger was definitely no stranger to law enforcement. With Mark in custody, on the 3rd of October, Coral, April's mother, made a public plea for any information about April's disappearance to be brought forward. Someone must have seen something or must know something, with Machynlleth being a small town. The UK's Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, also actually joined in this plea by encouraging anyone with information to come forward. He said the following, quote, "Having this happen to you, and the fact that she, April, suffers from cerebral palsy, something I know a little about from my own children, only makes this worse. My appeal would be to everyone, if you know anything, if you saw anything, heard anything, have any ideas you can bring forward, talk to the police." For some context, David Cameron's son passed away as a result of cerebral palsy a few years prior to April's disappearance in 2009. On the 5th of October, despite the fact that no body had been discovered, Dyfed-Powys police designated the investigation a murder inquiry. So Mark Bridger's charge had now been upgraded from suspicion of kidnapping to suspicion of murder. As sad as that is, it does make sense. At this point, it had been more than 48 hours since April was last seen alive, and we know that statistically the chances are fairly slim and continue to deplete after the initial 24 hours that a child is missing. As missingpeople.org present, 91% of missing children are found within 2 days. After a week, though, this drops to less than 2%. Additionally, by the 6th of October, these charges against Mark Bridger had increased again to child abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice. Whatever was discussed during Bridger's time in custody, and we will come back to it, the District Crown Prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service felt confident that they had the right person and that continuing with prosecution would be in the public interest. He also commended the police for their work on gathering evidence, stating there was sufficient evidence to charge Bridger at that point. By the 8th of October, again, Bridger had been charged for another crime of unlawful concealment and disposal of a body, so things had really progressed very quickly. Regardless of the progress made in this area of the case though, searches for April's body would continue in the area for months, heading into 2013, and was actually declared the largest missing person search in UK police history. Police and the public travelled from all areas of the UK to assist the community with search efforts. The use of specialised equipment was employed, specialist police officers were used, and volunteer searches were also frequently taking place. Meanwhile, April's family are still left unable to hold a funeral or burial for her, and still with many more questions than answers. And if that wasn't torture enough, 2 people in separate cases were also charged for making obscene and offensive comments about the case online only a few weeks after April's disappearance. It wouldn't be until January of 2013 until a small amount of closure, though nowhere near enough, could be had for the Jones family. At Mold Crown Court in North Wales on the 14th of January that year, Mark Bridger pled not guilty to the murder charge against April Jones. However, he did accept that he was, quote, probably responsible for her death. By no means is that a confession, but it did mark some progress in the case. The trial was set for the 25th of February, however it adjourned until April 29th at Bridges' defence team's request so that they could continue making inquiries. And so it began. On the 29th of April of that year, Mark Bridges stood trial for the abduction and murder of April Jones. During the trial, the prosecution presented a harrowing case detailing the evidence that linked Bridger to April's disappearance. An expert testified that 17 fragments of bone consistent with that of a younger person were found in the fireplace of Bridges' cottage, which is around a 10-minute drive away from Brynagog Estate where April was abducted from. Additionally, blood matching April's DNA was found in such amounts around his house that investigators concluded she must have been injured to the point where she would not have been able to survive. It is these forensic findings that ultimately convinced the police and the CPS to place those charges on Mark back in early October when he was detained. In response to this, Bridges' defence team, who at this point had been provided with over 2 extra months for their further inquiries, claimed that Bridger had accidentally run April over, panicked, and then burnt her remains in his fireplace, but had no recollection of dismembering her because he was in such an alcohol-fueled state of panic. Regardless of the eyewitness accounts that saw April get into a car matching Bridges, which was also being driven by a man who looked exactly like him, regardless of the sickening forensic evidence which found April's DNA in Mark Bridges' underwear, he accidentally ran her over, which nobody saw, and then instead of trying to get her medical attention, just decided to destroy her remains. The jury were left to deliberate on the 29th of May 2013, and by the 30th of May they had returned with a guilty verdict, for which he was the 37th person in the UK to receive the whole life tariff or the whole life order, with the judge calling him a pathological liar and a paedophile. For anyone listening outside the UK, the whole life tariff or the whole life order is basically the UK equivalent of the US's life without the possibility of parole, so Bridger will never get out. He can appeal, but it's quite unlikely that anything will come of it. This actually didn't stop him from embarking on an appeal in December of 2013, but fortunately he did drop this a few days before the hearing was due to take place. He was also attacked a few weeks into his sentence with a shiv, and he needed facial stitches for this. It should also be noted that Bridger apparently confessed to a prison chaplain during his remand period that he had disposed of April's body in the Avon Dulles, which is a river passing his cottage, but police do not believe this claim and instead think he scattered the remaining pieces of April in the area around his home. Mark Bridger remains in Strangeways Prison in Manchester, a Cat A and B prison for men. It's one of the most secure in the UK, and he'll probably die there. I think one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of this case is that April's family still don't have her back. They were able to have a funeral with the fragments they did have of her in September of 2013, but they'll likely never have all of her back. Bridger has never told anyone what he did with the rest of her, aside from the dubious story with the river, and this added a layer of pain for her family, who were denied the closure of laying her to rest. The trial was emotionally charged, the aftermath is emotionally charged. One thing we can be thankful for is the community rallying around April's family, offering their support throughout the ordeal. However, April Jones's story doesn't end with the conviction of her killer. Bridges' cottage was also purchased by the Welsh Government and demolished, and April's family were there to witness it being demolished. However, April Jones's story doesn't end with the conviction of her killer. Her disappearance and the subsequent trial left an indelible mark on her family, her community, and the entire nation. The Jones family has been instrumental in campaigning for better protections for children, including the introduction of April's Law, a proposed law aimed at tightening restrictions on those convicted of child sex offences. Police discovered 65 pieces of child pornography on Bridges' computer following his arrest, and Google and Bing have both altered their search engines to try and block any results from fetching child abuse images. On Bridges' laptop were actually images of Holly and Jessica and Caroline Dickinson, all of which were British schoolgirls who had been victims of sexually motivated murders. This is really concerning too, but Jasmine, April's older sister, recounts receiving a friend request from Bridger on Facebook prior to April's murder, which she declined because he was an absolute creep. She says in an interview that she told her parents and found it really odd because Mark was in his late 40s at the time and Jasmine was 16, so what possible reason would he have to want to become friends with her? So Coral actually recommended Jasmine just decline the friend request. Bridger had also searched for stuff like naked 5-year-old girl. He'd also concealed his own age from being seen on Facebook. On the day of April's disappearance, and likely her murder too, Mark had angrily reached out to an ex-girlfriend, spent the day looking up his indecent images of children, and had also tried to set multiple dates up. April's case also led to greater awareness of child safety and the dangers lurking in communities, even those as close-knit as Machynlleth. The legacy of April Jones is one of both tragedy and hope, a reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of vigilance and community support. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through the story of April Jones. If you've been moved by April's story, I encourage you to support organisations dedicated to child protection and safety. Every effort counts in ensuring that what happened to April never happens again. This has been Odious episode 5. Join me next week where we will go into the murder of Lynette White. Until then, stay sharp and stay safe.